just welcome you, remind you all that today's proceedings are being webcast, so it is not, I repeat, not under Chatham House rules. I hope that will not inhibit anybody. I'd now like to give the floor to the Right Honourable Paul Martin, who will introduce Ambassador Aranda, who will give us a charge and what she wants to get out of this. Paul.
Well, thank you, Tom. As you know, Ambassador Aranda is Mexican, and therefore I'm assured that the microphones will work. The Ambassador Lourdes Aranda received her bachelor's degree in international relations from El Colegio de Mexico. She undertook graduate studies in history and foreign affairs at l'Institut universitaire des hautes études internationales de Genève. She was appointed Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in December 2003. And she is as well holds the presidency of the Mexican Diplomatic Academy. However, as all of us in this room know, she has been an active participant in a great number of CIGI's meetings. And she has been a very important contributor to the body of knowledge that has been built up to support the evolution of the G20. Today is another step, and it's a crucial one along that way. For Lourdes is with us now in her capacity as Sherpa for the G20 summit to be held next June in Mexico. I could go on for a long time, but I think what we really do is want to hear from her. So let me simply say that in our discussions over the years, she's answered many questions. In concluding this introduction, therefore, I would ask her one more question on behalf of all of us, and that question really is, Lourdes, what can this meeting do today, tomorrow, and in the months ahead to help you ensure that the Los Cabos Summit does what it has to do if the G20 is to live up to the expectations that gave us birth? Ambassador, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this great introduction. And as always, I feel honored that you are the one who presents me. And I also feel honored to be back again in CIGI, and especially this year, where I think there's so many issues to discuss regarding the G20. I do consider this a remarkable group of experts, colleagues, and friends, and I find it always very useful to be here. In the past, I have always benefited from what many of the participants have told us, and also in the different CIGI events and discussions. Flying back from Mexico with Andrés Rosenthal, we were thinking when I started participating, and I remember it was in a meeting in Paris many years ago, in which at the moment we were speaking about the G5 and the G8. And well, the G5 doesn't exist anymore, and I hope that for next year or next 2 years, the G20 still exists. So I insist, I have this very close and useful relationship with CIGI. My team at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also some colleagues, we follow and read your articles and recommendations. Andres is always sure that I receive them. Sometimes I receive them more than one time, 2 or 3 times, but they are always, I insist, very, very useful to have. They have been proven useful for our brainstorming sessions in the ministry and for my discussions with my boss or my bosses. And they allows us to receive feedback regarding Mexico's ideas, proposals, and actions, and even sometimes some of my ideas and some of my concerns. So rather in the meeting or individually, I always benefit very much from your comments. I'm going to give you just a very brief overview of how we see the G20 major challenges at the moment, and afterwards I will go for the Mexican issue. But I do believe that after what happened last night, I'm glad you are the optimistic, and President Zedillo, the pessimistic about the G20, is not here today, so we are just the optimists today. But I do believe that the G20 is really in a critical moment. and not only the G20, also the global economy. But I think one of the major challenges we are facing today is to foster coordination, really to address the current economic and financial stability. And I do believe the coordination and the lack of political decisions have really, been very, very harmful for the G20 and for the global economy. The global economic outlook is challenging. I really don't believe I am the expert to talk about it. You are all, many of you, experts on that. But I cannot say if it's worse than 2008. And that discussion, we have had it in Mexico, or if it's going to be worse than 2008. But I know that the unemployment levels have reached record heights, which is a huge concern, and not only for politicians, for all of us. And the stock markets have experienced shocks since early August, and it seemed everybody was out on vacations and didn't realize it. The investor confidence reacts very early to the fiscal consolidation plans of some economies. And we have to realize also the overheating of some emerging countries' economies are also a matter of concern. We do believe that the social consequences of the crisis have worsened in many countries. And we also believe that the package agreed in the Euro Summit or in the European Union 2 days or 3 days ago, well, I believe it's a little bit too little too late, but I'm not the expert. This is my conclusion from what I read. We do believe that the summit statement was important and it was necessary at this moment. And it's a right step on the right direction, but I do believe we have to read through the small lines to understand some of the basic decisions where they're going to be funded or how they're going to be implemented. We know that the initial response of the markets was modestly positive, but we don't have any guarantee that this will remain like that in the following days. So really what we're facing at the beginning for the Cannes Summit, it's a challenging background. So it's really important that the leaders send a very strong political message next week to reassure markets, reinstate confidence, and present a credible plan to lead the world out of the crisis. And I'm not so sure that we can do it in such short time. And also that all the bad feeling that they got among some of the leaders during the last month can be surpassed in order to achieve the coordination we need. I'm just concerned. The French presidency started with the subject "New Ideas, New World," in which exactly the moment of the French presidency, the global economy the recovery was doing rather well, and we view the world in a different way at the beginning of 2011, and now, reality has caught with us, and we have to start from where we were in 2008. I think the most important issue that must happen, the most important action that is going to be adopted in France and is being discussed at the moment is the action plan, which sets a path to restore growth, to strengthen macroeconomic coordination, accelerate job creation, and push structural reform forward. Nevertheless, in this negotiation, which is taking place as I'm talking to you, there are several contentious issues on the action plan. One is that the commitment to the Cannes agreements do not seem to be as determined as they were back in Washington and in London, where a strong consensus was reached. There is also not a lot of consistency between the short and the long-term economic objectives of many countries, and this may affect the effectiveness of the plan. And there are some sensitive topics such as global imbalances, exchange rates, or as you know, foreign reserve currencies, that could further widen the differences between developing and developed countries. So the discussion in the following days of the action plan, which, by the way, it was a very, very, very good draft that came out of France, and that we hope it's not watered down during the negotiations, that will be a good result after Cannes. So we, Mexico, of course, are very expectant of what happens in Cannes, because from that, it will depend very much on how our presidency can do or can go. But the most important thing is that this plan of action can really translate into creation of jobs and well-being for all. So it's a big challenge. As I said, the Mexican agenda will be affected by the final results in Cannes, and in that sense, we will have to adjust it very much during the next 2 months. I'm going to talk about a little bit about our concern, and now I know most of you here about the concern of how the G20 is working. For Mexico, their priority is going to be, of course, the financial and economic issues in view of the extremely fragile international economic and financial situation. But I do believe that Mexico 2012 will be a good moment to take stock of what we have done as a group and assess where we want to go. And I don't believe this is, this is a contradiction. We will have to put attention on the crisis, but also we have to put attention on how we are working in this objective of on how to tackle the crisis, but more on the long-term G20 responsibilities. And if we keep acting on this crisis mode, then we will keep on forgetting, and the G20 will dilute itself and weaken every time. So Mexico will try to do it in a parallel way, how to strengthen the G20 as, and I don't say yet as an institution, but at least as a mechanism in order to become eventually an institution. We are aimed at making a responsible contribution to the G20, both at the substantive and procedural levels. As you know, and this is a very personal concern, but I know you many share it, we are worried that the G20 agenda has stretched too far and that we have not done enough to concretize our commitments. We should not forget that the G20's credibility it depends on this. And I always talk when they tell me, well, the credibility or the representative of the G20 is a problem. No, for me, really the problem of the G20 is that it has to deliver on its commitments, and if we don't do it, we won't have credibility. So the efficiency it's really crucial. So in that sense, we will be reviewing the G20 commitments in order to clearly assess in which ones we are behind in their compliance and what we have done to achieve them. And I think that in that sense, many of you have pointed out to us in your writings or in your text what you believe it's lacking in the G20, but it will be very useful for us to really, in the different issues we're going to discuss along today and tomorrow in food security, in development, in financial issues, in financial regulation, to really try to take stock on what has been done correctly and what has not really, well, not even correctly, but I don't, because some issues which we are leaving behind or not paying the attention they deserve. And probably they're going to be very different for each of you, but it's useful for Mexico if you can pinpoint exactly, well, what's the commitment in this issue? How much have you advanced in that? Because when we are inside working with the issues, we lose track of the full picture, and I think you have much more capacity to sometimes to do it. But, well, as I said, we will. The priority will be the financial and economic issues. Obviously, the four major areas, which is the implementation of the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth, which even if President Cedillo thinks we are not complying with it, maybe my good friend and the former Korean sherpa and me could really help to clarify that we are doing something and not just having declarations issued. The financial regulation and supervision, I think things have been done and things should be, we should advance in that area. The reform of the international monetary system and also the reform of the IFIS. So I do believe those will be important issues on the Mexican agenda. But also we will bring to the table some other important issues for both developed and developing countries. So where we do believe where a country could bring some added value without duplicating the work of the international organizations and other fora. And I do want to underline that. We have to understand that the G20 is not the fora to bring all the issues that are in the international agenda, because we think we can do it better. The only thing we're doing is weaken the G20, and we're going to, to become as obsolete as some international organizations are becoming. So we have to be very careful what we bring to the table of the G20 and what it can make a difference with other international organizations. Otherwise, we're just repeating the pattern. The Mexican other issues will be, of course, as I insisted, how to tackle the current international economic crisis. The issue of green growth, it's a big priority for Mexico, but it's not going to be treated as separately. What we believe is it has to be dealt across the board. And in each of the issues, it's not like a new subject, but how can we put the green accent on some of the reforms or the decisions we are taking? The issue of food security and volatility of price commodities are going to be also still very important on the agenda. And of course, how can this reflect on the creation of jobs, basically youth employment, which is the biggest concern for Mexico and I think for many of our economies. I think I'm taking too much of the time, but the issue of global governance, which President Sarkozy asked Prime Minister Cameron to give a report, I think it's going to be under the Mexican presidency to follow up on the report, because in France it's going to be presented, but there's not going to be that much time for discussion. We have worked very close with the British Sherpa, with John Conliffe, who is currently writing the report, and to provide some insights from what Mexico and other Latin American countries have done. We hosted a roundtable with the participation of John and other experts from Mexico and Latin America to enrich its document. So we are looking forward on what this global governance report. My impression is that it's not going to be really global governance. It's going to be much more G20 governance, and the commitment of Mexico is to keep on giving some concrete guidelines on how the G20 should work, and have commitments from the presidency, even the Mexican one, on how to really take different measures that will help the G20 survive this growing agenda. And it's not only the G20's responsibility. I can also tell you that there's pressures, and many pressures from NGOs, from international organizations, to bring more issues to the table. And sometimes it's not politically correct to say no, but I do think we have to be much more strict on what can the G20 do, what can it deliver. Otherwise, I think the expectations are very high, and the capacity to deliver is not that high. I can also tell you that, building on the experience from the COP16, Mexico will double its efforts to strengthen outreach towards all countries, both G20 and non-G20 members. We will also be much more close in contact with sub-regional, regional, and international organizations. But at the sub-regional level, for example, the Council on Baltic Sea States, which, they are small economies, but sometimes they ask us, why are we not being considered? Or, of course, NEPAD or other organizations in Asia. The parliamentarians, which I think they have to be informed of what we're working. And the business sector, it's already part of the G20, but we have to engage them in a very more concrete fashion. Civil society, of course, youth, foundations, NGOs, and of course, think tanks. And this is where I think I am appealing to you that we really need your insights, your advice, your critical evaluation. They are very, very useful. And these outreach activities, in the case of Mexico, they are going to be guided by a number of principles, which is going to be openness, inclusiveness, transparency, and above all, dialogue. In my case, I will be, as my time and responsibilities allow it, but I will be in contact as many times as I can with all of you. And also, I want to tell you that we appointed recently Dr. Roberto Marino, a special representative for the Mexican presidency of the G20. Maybe some of you know him, but he worked at the Central Bank of Mexico and the IMF for several years, and I'm sure you will get to know him very soon. and to be able to talk to him either in Mexico or when he's going abroad to be part of these outreach activities. I would now like to highlight the importance that think tanks will play in this outreach process. We consider that think tanks, research centers, and academic institutions are key actors that significantly contribute to transparency, analysis, and evaluation of public policy. So the official consultations among Sherpas or among vice ministers of finance are not enough. Your ideas, your argumentations, your discussions, and critical comments, they really complement and feed the G20 process and its activities. If I cannot speak for all of the Sherpas, I can say that, and John, maybe you agree with me, that really we read your articles, we read your publications, sometimes not completely, but at least executive summaries. But they are really very, very useful, and they help us think what we are doing. They also, most of the think tanks play a very important role in the follow-up, of following up the results, the commitments. And I think that's something I have mentioned as a Mexican priority, to really underline, well, you said this in 2008, you said this in 2010, and what's the results? I mean, I have pretty clear idea that in Doha, we know what are having the commitments and we haven't achieved them. And those issues are clear, but there are other more specialized areas that have been discussed in the G20, where I do think that either we are not complying fully, or the way we're complying, maybe it's creating more problems than why they were originally put in the agreement. So believe me, we really take into account your studies, CIGI especially, because my heart is very close to CIGI, but I do believe that everything that other institutions do are very useful. So we also believe that a very important step will be to create formal link between think tanks and the G20, and that's why, well, Mexico is thinking of having a Think 20 meeting, that it will be the way to listen to what all the think tanks all over the world are saying, not only the G20 countries' think tanks, but maybe from other parts of the world. We cannot believe that the G20 by itself doesn't need to hear the rest of the world. We do it at a governmental level. I'm trying to be as close as I can to the 3G group in the UN, and also in other international organizations. But we don't have a way to reach out to the think tanks all over the world. Maybe they are not thinking anything, maybe others, some of them are doing, but if we can have this kind of network, or at least this way of processing all the information, it will be very useful. So, Paul, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I really look forward to hear the discussions today. I will be here the full day, so in any case, if I can contribute to any of the discussions, I will be very glad to do it. And I hope really that we work very close with you during the Mexican presidency. Once again, thank you for having me here. And I don't know what charge means, but well, let's. I hope I give you the I would say the start off very gladly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lourdes, for that charge. And I think charge is the word, which is how do we ensure that the G20 is working, is relevant, is achieving things, is accountable for what it says it's going to do. Our first session today is on the global economy, which we have an excellent panel to kick this off. It's a panel, and I'm not going to go through each of their impressive CVs, because you have that in the material before you, and our time is short. But one of the things that I think you'll see with this panel is that they bring not only collectively but individually, a range of experiences from time with governmental institutions, time with think tanks, research institutes. Changyong was a G20 sherpa last year for Korea, now as chief economist for the Asian Development Bank. It highlights, I think, one of the things we try and achieve at CIGI, which is how do we, as a think tank, how do you get people who bring a range of interests and can connect to the policy network and to the questions that leaders and officials are grappling with. For those of you who have not been to one of our sessions before, we're set up this way because in this room, because what we want to do is to have a conversation. We don't want people up on a podium giving speeches, but rather we want to engage. And so we've set this up. We found it works fairly well, both with members of the panel. It just facilitates more of a discussion when you're looking into their eyes rather than looking down at the end of the table. But also we found that technology helps so that the others in the room feel part of it. We will start off with invite each of the panelists to make a short 3-minute intervention, which is really a challenge. We will then have a 35-minute or so discussion amongst the panelists based on what's been said, and we will then open it up to comments, questions from the rest of the room. When you are moved to ask a question or make a statement, you push the button on the microphone. That sends a signal. You just need to push it once. It sends a signal and it appears on a screen before me, and when we get to that point, I will call upon the tables. Your mic will come on automatically. Do not push it again, or you will be eliminated from the list, and you will go back to the bottom. The one exception we'll make is for Ambassador Aranda, who, if she has any questions at any point, wants to say, "What the hell are you talking about?" Or let's get specific, or that's not real. Please feel free to raise your hands, and we will call upon you. With those introductions, let's get into it. I think those of us who have been around summits for some time know that one spends a year or more planning a very careful agenda, very careful policy research, and something happens, and all of a sudden the agenda is not what you had planned. And I think we're in that world today. December of last year, we CIGI, together with Jacques and the Institut Francais de Relations Internationales, had a few days in Paris where we met with the French Sherpa team. We had a session with Rhee. We had some other things where we were plotting out this brave new world under the French presidency, new ideas, and how one was going to implement things. And I think Jacques, I'm going to call in a second, would probably say, look, in retrospective, the agenda we foresaw at that time is not the agenda that we face today. And I think that's the reality. Last night focused in good measure on the Eurozone crisis, because that's where the attention is, and I know it's going to receive comments at this table, but I hope we will not spend all of our time on the Eurozone crisis, because I think it does raise some broader questions. Where is the process of policy cooperation within the G20? Europe is part of the global economy, but the G20 was formed as a response to a global crisis affecting many players, and committed themselves to a process of cooperation to achieve reduce imbalances, to achieve sustained growth, and I think what role does the G20 have with respect to the Europe crisis, and what's happened to that broader cooperative agenda, and how do we get to growth and employment. Institutional reform, the FSB, how do we, clearly, if you see the financial crisis, we're on the precipice of, again, not enough is being done. I don't think anybody could argue with that. The FSB was created, but there are questions. How do we harden what, in fact, is a soft institution is a major challenge that has been on the G20's agenda. I think the European crisis raises issues with respect to sovereign debt restructuring, and we're operating on the fly again. We've been through this before. Amar has Bhattacharya, who's had a lot of experience in the World Bank and working with G7, G8 earlier, and G20 has seen this, but we don't have agreed rules of the game on sovereign debt restructuring. We find ourselves scrambling. The current situation, partly because of the imbalances, for other reasons, the whole question, what are the real rules of the game with respect to capital flows? And we see countries, whether it's Switzerland or whether it's Brazil, having to scramble and implement ad hoc measures. The system doesn't seem to be providing a framework for discussion and for agreement on these. We've seen, some would say, a resurgence of the G7, in a sense, over the last few months, with the G7 announcing swap agreements with, because of developments in Europe. We've seen the G7 issue a communique again, which they had gotten out of the habit. And we saw at the most recent G20 meeting when a number of emerging markets said we were prepared to consider putting major new resources into the IMF. Essentially, the G7 countries said, mind your own business. Fund has enough money, we will deal with this. And I think this has huge implications for, I mean, we're facing not just economic challenges, but we're facing major governance challenges. So with those few comments to put some thoughts in your mind, I will first turn to Jacques Mistral, who's comes from the epicenter of, in some ways, of the crisis, and I'm sure will comment on that. Jacques.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, let me say that it's a pleasure to be back in Waterloo. Thank you for the invitation. I think natural, following your invitation to speak, to use my 3 minutes about the euro, and to say that two things. Number one, the end of the euro, which has been trumpeted for months now, would have been a very bad news for international economic cooperation, for any sort of better global governance. So it's natural that it's an important element at the beginning of those reflections. But the good news is that the end of the euro was extremely premature, and that we will jump to the other issues you have mentioned, because the euro is not the major issue today. I would just remember one thing, which is that since the beginning of the so-called euro crisis, the euro in dollar is always remained close to $1.40. And that's surprising for a currency which is supposed to be at the deepest of its crisis. I think one of the two stories is wrong. Either the euro is in deep crisis and unattractive, or the euro remains at 1.40, and you have to tell a different story. And I have a different story than the one emphasizing the absence of solution. I will just mention two ideas in this direction. I know I am in a minority on the global playing field, but I could develop these two ideas as long as you wish. Number one, the political process, which is looking for solutions to our problems, is speedy. It's rapid. It's efficient. It's not a judgment, because if it were a judgment, I would say that what we are seeing in Brussels is extremely chaotic. And if you make day-to-day newspaper articles, you can only say that it's difficult. But to have a judgment on the process, you have to have a benchmark. And I love to take a benchmark in Washington. And if you compare the ways governments in Washington and in Brussels are looking for solutions to similar problems of major sovereign debt problems, of major deficits, of major unsustainable public finance, I would easily qualify the process in Brussels as going relatively quickly in a relatively orderly direction. Would you say the same about Washington? No, because we know that since the beginning of the year, the issues like the deficits, the debt ceiling, and other, any way you take the problem of American public finance, you see it doesn't go anywhere, and that we have no idea of any solution before January 2013. So first point, the process is not as chaotic, as slow as so frequently said. Second, the steps which have been made since the spring of 2010 are impressive, and they are all accumulating in the same direction. I will not enter in the discussions, in the details of the plans, but we are making progresses on both sides. Number one, on the crisis management issues. Number two, on designing new institutional framework. I will not qualify this because we have no time, but we come back possibly later. I will just conclude by emphasizing a major difference between last year, say spring 2010, and now. And the major difference in the European process is German attitudes. In the spring 2010, remember, the Germans were saying only one thing: we want to punish the sinners. And this clearly was not a good starting point for finding solutions. And in effect, we did not move forward quickly in 2010. But the Germans make their homework, as we know, very seriously. And now they came to a conclusion that rescuing the failed governments, that designing a better framework was exactly in their interest. And since the summer, we see that the Germans are moving forward and helping design the solutions, naturally in their interests, according to their interests, to their culture. But I think, in summary, that this is a good thing to have that as an engine for finding a way forward.
Thank you, Jacques. I read in the FT this morning that President Sarkozy gave a speech saying that the French need to become much more like the Germans. So this, I'd now like to turn to Paolo Subacchi from Chatham House, a good partner with us. Paolo and Paul Jenkins, a distinguished fellow with CIGI, jointly wrote a paper on policy cooperation within the G20 last year. Paul, unfortunately, can't be with us today because his son is getting married, and one does have to choose priorities. But Paolo has looked at this question of policy cooperation, and I'd ask her now to comment how she sees the current situation as against that earlier diagnosis.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning. And thank you to CIGI for this splendid gathering. And every time CIGI manages to expand the network of participants across the world. And it's very impressive. And it's also very impressive to see the CIGI is like Shanghai. There is always a new building every time I come to Waterloo. So it's the same pace of buildings. I hope it's not going to be a property bubble. Anyway, I'm trying to, I know I have 3 minutes, so I'll try to be very, very short and try to be telegraphic and address some of the issues that you, Tom, put in the email to the panel. First of all, the euro crisis is still on, and I agree with you that we shouldn't really focus on the euro crisis today, but the issue is the euro crisis is going to set and shape and determine the agenda in Cannes next week. That will be the main topic on the agenda. In some way, it will actually crowd out the other key topics which were on the agenda. I agree with Ambassador Aranda that the agenda was very crowded, and now we have, with the crisis, we have the effect of effectively focusing the agenda on what needs to be done. The crisis is a European, but also is a global crisis. It's not yet, but it could have very important and significant spillovers if the crisis roll over in Europe. That's why there is across the world a very strong concern and the willingness to work together and try to avoid what I tend to call another Lehman Brothers event. Of course, in some way we are at the same point as we were in London 2009, and it's interesting the op-ed that President Obama had yesterday in the FT, where he explicitly referred to the need to create a firewall to stop Europe's crisis spreading. So again, the consensus is we need to work together to avoid a major disaster. Then how it can be done, it's still under discussion. But I think we have seen now a plan, and the plan is not, as it was thought about a few weeks ago, an intervention of the BRICS or the BRIC countries in the European bond market, but rather a provision of, we call it financial safety net, with a credit, a flexible credit line, whatever we want to call it, and whatever the modalities we choose, but an intervention to provide these firewalls to avoid a contagion of the Greek crisis to other countries in Europe, in particular Italy. So that requires a coordinated action, and that's what President Obama is calling for, and what I believe other G20 countries are pushing. But it's not enough to provide this firewall. Also, we need a plan for growth. I believed in the action plan that Ambassador Arandas referred to contains and has some medium-term measures to address the issues of economic growth. And this is where the issue of policy coordination in a more sophisticated way come into play. So policy coordination in a way then the work that Chatham House and CIGI did together some months ago in a report we published early this year, which was exactly talking about policy cooperation as a framework for growth, for economic growth. So policy cooperation is not only let's help each other when we are in trouble. In other words, to use the G20 as we say, a crisis committee, but also to have a plan, a framework for growth, which actually put the G20 into, give the G20 a more complex task, which is the steering committee role. So we have to think the long-term growth, and coordination means to think in terms of national and domestic policies in terms of the impact they can have on other countries, so spillovers and interlinkages. So that means we need to think in terms of surplus countries and deficit countries, countries that can lead growth by, for example, stimulating domestic demand. This is something which, again, I know is under discussion by the G20. It's really, it's the acknowledgement that not, if everybody try to support growth through an export-led strategy, then we are in a zero-sum game, so it doesn't work. So we need to coordinate our policies. That comes to my final point, which is the agenda. Again, I still believe that the G20 can have a larger agenda, a more broader role, which actually involves also a revision of the membership. But at the moment, still, given that the crisis is still with us, we need really to focus on the agenda, again, a crisis committee agenda. And for this, because we are aware, this is a paper, actually, I got some copies here, then Chatham has prepared for the governance review then the UK government put together. One point we made is membership is very important, but let's focus what we need to do. So we need to create some sort of legitimacy by proxy, by increase and enhance the accountabilities of the G20. Again, all points that Ambassador Aranda's made clear in her speech. And for this, I have a plea here. Please drop from the communication and the final communique of the G20 any reference to the Doha round. We know that it's going to happen. It's always there. Every time there is a G20 communique, there is a reference to the Doha round, and we're all happy to. Please, it's not credible anymore. So fine to say we are all against protectionism, but let's not be more concrete than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. I now want to move to the other side of the world and turn to the two representatives we have from Asia. We've heard Jacques say that, you know, Europe is progressing smoothly, more or less. It's the US that doesn't have its act together as much as we do. Paolo stressed the need for policy cooperation on a positive agenda going forward and some US plans. I'd be very interested now to see how these sets of questions are perceived from the other side of the Pacific and from our guests who have probably traveled the longest distance. So first, I'd like to turn to Mark Twirlwell of the Lowy Institute in Australia to share his views with us.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to CIGI for the invitation to be here. It's a great privilege. I got 3 minutes, so I thought I'd make 3 points. I guess the first one I'll start off where everybody else has, which is with the Eurozone crisis. I mean, as we all know, the G20 is a creature of crisis. It was born from crisis. It's risen through its ability to manage crisis, and I guess it's going to live or die on its ability, its continued ability to be a manager, a crisis manager. And as we've seen, you know, what happens in Europe is going to dominate the agenda near term. This actually has some upside, in my opinion. It's a small upside, but it still has some. One is, as previous speakers have mentioned, it's actually helped focus attention. So what looked in danger of being a kind of a sprawling and ill-focused agenda in Cannes is instead going to be something that's much tighter and more focused on what the world really cares about, and I think that's a good thing. And it's also, I think, given a bit of teeth, maybe not enough, but a little bit more teeth to things like the mutual assessment process. It's made people focus a little bit more on these issues, paid a little bit more attention to them. Over the last 6 months or so, countries got a little bit more serious. So there's still, I think, there's been some limited upside from this. Unfortunately, I think there's also a significant downside, which is that rightly or wrongly, the G20 is going to be judged on how this crisis plays out and how effectively we manage it. And you know, from the far side of the world, this looks an extremely intractable problem, and it doesn't look like one that's amenable to short or even medium-term solutions. It's one that's likely to be with us for a while. And I think that is a fundamental challenge for the G20. We're going to look at, you know, if you're going to be judged on how successful you are in managing this, and it's going to be something that's very tough to manage, that's going to be a big hurdle for the G20 to overcome. So I worry a bit about that. The second point, and it's a very broad one, is there's this large challenge that I think we're all familiar with, but it bears restating for the G20, and that's the problematic circumstances which we currently face. So we've got this paradoxical situation. We're in a world where globalization in many ways is more intense than it's ever been, where spillovers across countries matter more than they ever have done. But at the same time, and we see it particularly in my part of the world, there's a resurgence of nationalism, a resurgence of countries focused on their own self-interest, their own looking inward, if you like. And how you balance those two things out seems very problematic. And there's an interesting parallel to that purely on the economic side. You've got a story that on the one hand, you've kind of got a a decoupling in structural growth trends. So there are parts of the world, and again, I'm thinking particularly of my region, where the growth story is very exciting at the moment, where in some ways you can sort of look at the problems that are happening in the core as kind of an interesting and provocative sideshow, but they're not where the real action is. It's not where growth's happening. It's not where the huge gains in living standards are coming from. And yet, the vulnerability to spillovers from that core, the cyclical linkages between economies are getting tighter and more close than ever. And how we manage that seems to be problematic. And again, that comes back to this mutual assessment process, to this looking at how you manage spillovers, the spillover reporting that the IMF is now doing. So we're sort of grappling with the idea that we need new tools and new processes. We're grappling with the idea that the world's changed, but some of those changes, I think, are making it more difficult rather than less to deliver the things that we need to have. And the final third point is that the Eurozone crisis is the second major source of instability arising from, I guess, the traditional core, the G7, if you like, of the world economy over the last few years. And for those of us sort of the middle-sized economies, the so-called middle powers, it's quite striking that we're sort of having to ride these choppy global waters as these waves from things that are largely out of our control are coming to us. Now, the G20 should be the big tool that the middle economies can use to try and manage this process, to have our input in, whereas an individual, we have no big say on what the big players do, on whether they manage or mismanage their economies. So in theory, this is the way that we get together and we put all of our individual voices together and get some collective action out of that. But what worries me, and Tom, you touched on this, is if you again look at the last 6 months or so, the tendency seemed to be for the G7, if you like, to make a bit of a comeback, to claw some of this stuff back from the G20 and say, look, actually, this is our problem. We'll deal with it. You guys don't worry so much about that. And again, that worries me about the future of the G20 going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Now, Changyong, Rhee, who has seen these sets of issues from many angles until his current appointment. As I mentioned earlier, he was G20 Sherpa for Korea and had the challenge of organizing the Korea summit. He's now chief economist with the Asian Development Bank, and I think can speak to us with a variety of perspectives, both on the economics and how the G20 could be more effective in helping.
Thank you, Tom. And first of all, let me say that I'm really great, my honor to be here. And I also I want to thank you again for the CIGI's great help while we are hosting the G20 in last year, even though it's a little bit late. And without your support, we couldn't have that very meaningful and successful summit last year. And also I'm saying I'm really impressed with this building. And the alcohol and book is an ideal combination that I'm used to in my graduate school. So I feel quite cozy in this building. And having said that, because of time limit, let me just focus on the how the Asian countries see the progress of the European situation. And probably I can have more time later on the other topics. I want to just focus on, mention brief 4 points. One is that Asia is not completely decoupled from Europe and the US. Even though many people say Asia has more fiscal space to cope with the crisis, and Asia's growth is high, so they may be able to cope with this crisis. But simultaneous recession in Europe and US will not be a small thing, and we are not decoupled at all. And even though the magnitude of the shock may be smaller than the shock in 2008, but we believe this situation will more likely to continue. The duration of the shock will be longer. And because of the uncertainties in financial market, the financing cost, funding cost of dollar in trade, the trade financing will be really increase a lot. That will significantly affect the gross export performance of most Asian countries relying on heavily still on export. So we are very much relieved, even though the current package may not be enough, or maybe not, or maybe a little bit too late. But still, this is a really important progress, and we are relieved that the European leaders are going into taking these problems more serious and come up with some solutions. So our first reaction is we are relieved. Our second reaction is that actually we have a very mixed feeling when we look at these packages, because when we compare the current package that European countries giving to Greece with the packages we received in 1997. So I think in our feeling is that probably after these things, many economists in Asia will calculate what's the difference between the packages that Greece received and packages that Asian countries have. And that is, we have a very emotional and mixed feeling. So we know that this is very important, but on the other hand, what happened in 1997? Why at that time there's no global kind of effort to solve this problem simultaneously? At that time, we believe our problem is more liquidity problem rather than solvency problem. But now we look at the packages. Is that something is reversed? Whether it's the right one? This is really a question that many Asian countries will impose. In that sense, I think, Lourdes, I think it's very important in Cannes Summit, or even, I think, open up, but Mexican Summit, that now, you mentioned, Paula mentioned that President Obama mentioned the ring fencing. But these days, when we heard about ring fencing, it's about ring fencing Italy and Spain and European countries. What happened to the more innocent bystanders? Trade financing and all other global safety net for emerging economies rather than for European countries. So if you come up with the idea of how to ring fence European countries through the EFSF only, then I think in Cannes Summit, many people who cannot speak out will feel that International Monetary Fund is a European monetary fund, and the G20 is only for still the advanced economy. So it's very important when European leaders and the G20 announce these packages, European packages, it's very important to simultaneously mention how to ring fence innocent bystanders. I think that's the second important point. The third important point, when we look, maybe it's a little bit long-term view, but we are very much interested in when we look at the 1997 experience, the way we recover from the crisis was basically exchange rate depreciation. That promote export, that promote the growth, and that helps us to solve our debt problem. Now, even though you support Greece, I don't know whether, I really hope that it works, but we see two problems. One is that Greece still cannot adjust the exchange rate, whether they can find a new source of growth. The growth is very important for Greece to solve this problem. Without it, whether Greece will come back to this problem in a couple of years later or not is a big issue. At the same time, in 1998, central bank play a very important role. You cannot solve all this problem by fiscal side. In transition, there must be some mechanism to stabilize the market confidence. That's what Prime Minister Martin mentioned and President Sergio mentioned yesterday. We need more stronger involvement of ECB, and whether that can be possible in the long run in transition, that seems to be very interesting things that from Asian perspective and from Asian experience. Last point is the involvement of China. I think this is not a one-time event. I think it's very symbolic. First of all, in Asia, Japan actually contributed lots of funds for this international public goods. So it's not the first time that Asia participates in the international public good in using our fund. But China is different from Japan. Japan was an advanced economy, so the interest is in line with the advanced economies. But China, as we mentioned yesterday, is a poor country still. But they have a lot of resources. Now they are coming to join this rescue effort. And I think it's important because China also has to feel the global responsibility. It's a good sign. But I think it's more than just one event. Because of the aging demographic structure, because of our development of financial market situation, I think Asia now really become a capital exporter. So no longer it will be strange for Asians to participate as a capital supplier rather than receiver. So this will be a start of the big change. And Asia has to prepare for this change also. And I think world financial market probably need to be recognized that this is a trend rather than just one-time events. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now turn to Oussama Himani. On the program, it says he's an independent consultant, which he is, but he's followed these issues from time in the IMF, from in the private sector, and he now advises a variety of people, including the Saudis' financial authorities. So he's got a broad perspective. Oussama.
Thank you, Tom, and I would like to start, like all the rest, by thanking you for this invitation and for really saying that it's my first time here at CIGI, and I'm must be quite impressed, and certainly like you, as an avid whiskey drinker, I feel very comforted by all the barrels here. It's a broad range of issues that you presented us with, and with 3 minutes, I really, I try and come up with just a few punchlines and hope to leave the rest for the discussion. I think the event last night, the Right Honourable Paul Martin had very nicely highlighted the different cultural issues between the members of the G20. And this is really an elegant way of saying that they really have very different priorities, which is the benchmark against which we should really judge how effective the G20 have been. And overall, it's actually been a relatively successful organization at crisis management. I think over the last year, maybe the agenda had been not made as much progress as one would have hoped, but that's also because countries approach the issue. The issues on the agenda are regarded with different priorities by different countries, and there wasn't a clear global crisis facing them. Now we have a global crisis. Any way you cut it, whether through looking at the equity market, it's not just within the euro, it's a global issue. You look at equity markets, bond markets globally, and this is very much like Paula said. I think the euro crisis will crowd out many of the other issues on the G20 agenda, and that, I think, I agree with you, is an upside. It's an opportunity to really refocus. There are two issues I would highlight. I think would be very useful for next year's Mexican presidency of the G20 to focus on. One is sovereign debt restructuring. We've had a decade of experience with many high-profile sovereign debt restructuring. And we've had a lot more than a decade, but in the last decade specifically, starting with Argentina in 2001, we've had some disorderly and some orderly. We've had Argentina, we've had Uruguay, we've had the Dominican Republic. Luckily, they're all in Latin America. Well, they're mostly in Latin America, so maybe the Mexicans are in a particularly good position to present some experiences to the Europeans who genuinely lack it. I think looking at the statement that was issued last Thursday, and I'm happy to discuss this at later, but I think it betrays a complete lack of understanding of the basics of sovereign debt restructuring. The second issue I would think the G20 would be useful to focus on is the issue of capital flows, which you highlighted at the beginning, and how the rules of the game regarding capital flows. Capital flows are not under IMF jurisdiction. There is some partial WTO jurisdiction on them regarding certain investments. Controls on capital flows come in and out of fashion during crises, but there are no sort of rules of the game of how how one would handle conflicts in this area. The fact that Brazil last year raised the cry of currency war is certainly one reason why it would be a lot more comforting if we knew there are rules of the game that everyone would subscribe to. I will stop here and happy to look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Oussama. Turn to our last speaker for this introductory round, Amar Bhattacharya, who has followed these issues, as I said earlier, through a variety of fora and has attended a variety of G20 meetings, and I guess will tell us whether is the map really a success, or is Ernesto Zedillo right?
Yeah, I'm actually, I could speak right now at very much what we emerging markets are thinking about going into Cannes, but that's probably better saved for questions since you'll give me more time. I'll instead play a broader perspective and take very much the questions that have been put by the organizers. And let me say that the global economy segment is the centerpiece and the raison d'etre of the G20. And in that sense, even though it is the centerpiece, it is an unfinished house. Having said that, let me say that the workers are working in building the house. They haven't all gone away. And that, in that sense, that's my response to President Zedillo, that actually there's a lot of work underway in the G20 in terms of institution building that needs support and that we need to be a little patient about, and we need to recognize continuity rather than take it 1 year at a time. So how do you judge effectiveness of the G20? And let me propose 2 criteria. The first is it effective in providing strategic guidance and in enhancing, not undermining, existing institutions? And the second criteria I would use is it providing leadership by example, and is it subjecting itself to mutual accountability? So if you're going to use those criteria, what are the areas in which you would judge the G20? So the first one, which is by far probably the lion's share of the substantive work, falls under the rubric of what last night was called macroeconomic coordination. And let me go through a few elements and use the metrics, as it were. The first is getting out of the current mess. And we've all talked about the euro crisis. A question I would pose to you is, what role has the G20 played, and what role should it play in resolving the current crisis? And let me also say that my view is actually the G20 has shown itself to be a better steering committee than a crisis committee. So I don't think actually it has done a good job in terms of the crisis response. Part of the reason for it is it doesn't have an architecture to support a kind of a crisis response. There aren't kind of a telephone lines that you pick up and you say, just like you do in the G7, and say, okay, we have a crisis and we have to have something at 4 a.m. tomorrow morning. They don't have that. Second, the main reason it has not been able to play a role is because the 2 principal powers, Europe and the United States, have been unwilling to give up the sovereignty in terms of allowing the G20 to play a role. So that would be the first area. The second area is putting the world on a better trajectory after the crisis, and that's the whole MAP exercise. And I'm going to use the frame that President Zedillo put out yesterday to show areas of progress. So he said last night that the IMF has a perfunctory role. When this process started, the IMF indeed had a very circumscribed role. But let me say today, it has an absolutely central role, because it took a while for the social capital to build and for us emerging markets to feel comfortable that the IMF would actually be even-handed in the role that it plays. Second, subjecting yourself to mutual accountability. One of the very important things of the MAP process is that the big players have come forward to subject themselves to the peer exercise. That includes China, it includes India. So you are beginning to see, by the way, and it excludes some country. Canada got dropped out of the exercise, by the way. So it shows you that there is some realignment taking place. And the third thing, which is what Undersecretary Aranda talked about, which is this whole action plan. And that action plan is the culmination of a process, and the question is, will it have teeth? And there are 2 ways in which teeth have to be defined. First, is there specificity in the actions that are being committed? And second, what are the metrics that you are going to use in terms of judging those actions? So this is an area where the outside world can have a huge influence in raising the bar. I think you will find the Cannes Action Plan to be much better than we would have imagined 6 months ago. But I think it will not be sufficient in terms of the kind of accountability that we would like. Third, there's a huge amount of work that is needed on the infrastructure for macroeconomic coordination. So what has the G20 done this year? It has worked on global financial safety nets in terms of instruments, the issue of resources. There's been a lot of work on IMF surveillance. There has been a lot of work on global liquidity. There has been relatively modest work on the SDR, despite the fact that the French had said this would be a big issue. And there has been work, by the way, on capital flows. But in a very interesting way, a lot of differences of views. Having said that, all of these issues will remain, and there are three areas which I think we did not make much progress, but which are very central. The issue of reserve currency, the issue of sovereign debt restructuring, and the issues of tax cooperation. Okay. Now, all of this suggests that the agenda that is out there is inherently large, inherently interconnected, inherently complicated. So this issue of selectivity becomes a very difficult one. It's easy to say we should be selective, but if the world is complicated and large, you have to be able to be prepared to take it. And by the way, this does not include several other issues which the finance ministers have been focusing on: commodity markets, energy pricing, energy subsidies, climate finance, infrastructure financing. So all of these are out there, and how you get a better measure of of discipline is something that Mexico, I think, will really help in the way it's proposing. My final point on this area is governance remains a central issue in terms of the future agenda. Let me remind you that the G20 committed this year, in 2012, in the coming year, to a comprehensive review of the quota formula and to a significant realignment of the board of the IMF. Delivering on that will be one of the aspects on which, will be a very important litmus test given what we are seeing in the global environment. Quickly, two other points on financial regulation. I think it is in this area where the G20 has done the most. And it's ironic because we see the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the Occupy Wall Street movement implies two things. One is that regulatory capture is still pervasive, and second, that we are asleep at the wheel. But this is the area where I believe actually the most amount of progress has been made leading up to Cannes. The problem is there's no disclosure. And there's been a huge, let me give you examples. There's been work on implementation on banking regulations, OTC derivatives, compensation practices, including a very thorough peer review on the reduction of over-reliance on external rating agencies. You will see proposals coming up on the global SIFIs, on shadow banking, on consumer protection. You will see work on market integrity, on the whole issues of macroprudential regulations. It's nuts and bolts, it's very detailed, it's very boring, but a lot of work, and there is scorecards, but it's not disclosed. So one of the very important aspects, again, as the Undersecretary was raising, is how do you have a measure of disclosure, not only for the G20 to the outside world, but to the public. In closing, if I could just close on the issue of trade, which is the third major pillar here, G20 will not have any role on trade unless trade ministers are involved in the discussion. So you have two options. One is say nothing, or the other is get serious and say, sorry, this is one in which we charge you trade ministers to be accountable. It certainly is not going to come from the present apparatus. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar. I think we've had an excellent group of comments. Some were, of our speakers, were more disciplined in keeping to their time than others, but I had given them an impossible task, so I didn't impose the 3 minute rule, but now we find ourselves a little squeezed for time. So what I'm going to do now is give panelists an opportunity to quickly to make the comment they didn't make in the first round, or to pick up on comments that one of the other speakers may have made, or to pose a question. I have a list of questions if people aren't ready to do that. But we'll do that for about 10, 15 minutes, and then we will open up the floor. So I invite the floor to begin to think of questions, comments you might want to make. I mean, one of the things that strikes me in the discussion is there is view, Jacques, others, that there is progress. It's slow. Sometimes it's messy, but it's a process. It's important. It takes time. But there's also the view that was raised in terms of, well, how will the G20 be measured? And if so much of what's happening is invisible, and they're going to be measured by the euro crisis, does that leave us with a huge credibility problem, and what does that mean for future policy cooperation and effectiveness? Jacques.
I think it's really too bad that the Euro story has crowded out all the other elements of the agenda as we discussed in this first round, because as I said, naturally the Euro, the sovereign debt problem in Europe is a major concern for the world economy, but it's not the only one. And second, it's a problem which is, if I may say, a domestic problem, because I remember a second fact, which is that the Eurozone has a balanced balance of payments with. So this is not, the chaotic answer is due to the fact that there is a burden to be shared within European countries. But in principle, we don't need any money from outside to help resolve the crisis. So for many reasons, I think that in effect, as the Ambassador Aranda mentioned, as Paoloa suggested, we should reintroduce forcefully the other elements. And I would like to only emphasize one of them, which has been mentioned, and I'm sure that my colleagues will introduce other suggestions. But one of the major problems which has not made any progress this year, or very small progresses, is the coordination of macroeconomic policies at the global level. And we remain with a huge problem of global imbalances. We remain with huge questions about the future of reserve currencies, which have been completely sidelined by the discussions about Greece, which is definitely not the issue. So I would welcome any opportunity to ask my colleagues to say how they see the improvement of coordination between major economic players, between China, the United States, and naturally Europe, but as one of the three participants in this game where we will find common solutions together or no solution at all.
Yes, I think the fact that the G20 summit is crowded out by the current important topic is not the first time. In London summit, it was 2008 crisis. And Toronto summit, if you remember, that was start of the European sovereign debt crisis. And we prepared all other topics, but the Toronto summit, the discussion only about the fiscal consolidation. Seoul summit, we want to promote development, but this currency war become a main topic. And basically, as a sherpa, I felt like we prepared all the dishes, but our guests do not want to eat any other but except that one. And now in Cannes summit, I have some point not disagreeing with you, but on the other hand, whatever we do and whatever the government do, I think the focus, media focus, everything we just focus on Europe. It's inevitable. And there is a good chance that the Mexican summit also will be crowded out by the European situation if it continues. So I think in some sense, as you mentioned, it's a positive thing. That really shows the role of the G20 as it's a really important mechanism to solve most impending global problems, even though we have to work with other structural problems. So I think we have to take that challenges. On the other hand, as for your view about whether the European problem is just a European problem, that I may not be buy that argument very easily, because yes, it's true, Europe may have enough money to solve this problem. It's a European country which has to solve this problem. There's definitely a big spillover effect, as I mentioned in my previous talk. And the US monetary policy has a large spillover effect in all other countries. Now we are interconnected. So I think that's what many other countries are asking the European leaders to act quickly. So it's a European problem, but at the same time, global problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to support that. I mean, that's certainly the view that we'd have too. I mean, the lessons from 2007, 2008, the problems that start domestically can go global very quickly. And it also seems to me, I mean, if the G20 is designated as the peak global economic body, it's pretty clear that there's one peak global economic problem facing the world at the moment. If it didn't dominate the agenda, then one would have to say that there's something gone badly wrong with the G20 if instead it spent its time doing lots of things around the edges and ignoring the elephant in the room. I think that would be hugely destructive of its credibility. It's a completely separate issue. I just want to pick up something that Amar said, which is a different set of issues, but I think they're also interesting for the G20, and that's the FSB set of issues. And I think I'd strongly agree. If we were looking for a success story, I think you look to the FSB and you can find all sorts of lots of good and very positive initiatives. It's grappled with lots of important issues. You can hear, and here's something where you can pick and say the G20's done something successful here. However, there's also a lot of questions that the same thing is raised, and it sort of raised all the way through. I mean, and at one end, there's the issue of implementation. If you sort of look at the huge volume and the complexity of the issues that are coming out of the FSB right now, and then look at the implementation challenges that imposes on G20 members with a range of capacities. I mean, they're huge, and it's going to be interesting watching. I think countries are going to struggle with a lot of these, and what, if any, role can the G20 play in helping aid that implementation? So that's kind of at one end of it. At the other end of it, there's now I've heard some critics will say, well, has the whole process kind of missed the point in a sense? It was set up to stave off a major crisis. And lo and behold, we're now in the middle of another major crisis, and a lot of the things that the FSB, at least in its original formulation and its tie-ups with the BIS, was set to do to deal with, don't look like they match particularly well with the current crisis. For example, all those issues about zero rating on sovereign assets and the centrality of sovereign assets when we're sitting in the middle of a sovereign crisis. And that's kind of one of those challenges, I think, that we have, that the world moves very quickly, and our ability to regulate and to cope with it is a constant challenge. So, big success story, but also lots of interesting challenges that come out of it.
Just before giving the floor to Amar and then Paolo, I mean, and there's this, does the G20 focus effectively on crises or not? But I mean, if you go back to Toronto, I've just raised this question, but if you go back to Toronto, it was President Obama who said we really need a discussion on growth, and you can't have, expansionary fiscal contraction. It's too early. And some people point out that one of the great problems of the 30s was people moved too early to restore normal policies and practices. But the discussion in Toronto got snuffed out. It very quickly moved to fiscal contraction because that was a nice, easy line. You raised the point of, well, I mean, Jacques said, look, in Europe, we really don't need money. We've got enough money to solve the problem, and I think that's right. For confidence reasons, you may want to, but I think Changyong said, I mean, the real question is, where is the growth in Greece going to come from? I mean, there are much bigger problems, and that applies not just to Greece, but that's a problem for Europe, and that's a problem for the United States, and a broader problem. And I just, are the real issues, there may be some good work on plumbing, but are the real issues being shunted aside because of some of these crises issues? Amar, you have the floor.
Just to continue the conversation, I don't think that Europe and US can have it by saying that, our problem is our problem, and, global coordination is what the rest of you do. So I do think that Europe has to then show that it is being able to deliver on those aspects that we would consider as important spillovers. Okay, so that would be my reaction. Second, I'm going to be provocative and just say that this whole sovereign debt issue is partly self-inflicted. If you sort of stand on every mountaintop and you say we have a sovereign debt issue, and that sovereign debt issue requires short-term fiscal contraction, then you shouldn't be surprised that the markets wake up one day and say you have a sovereign debt issue. So I actually think that you should all look at the fiscal monitor of the IMF that came out at the time of the annual meetings, and it shows to you very clearly that the sovereign debt issue in Europe is quite manageable, except for Greece. So I think in a way, the challenge is really medium-term fiscal consolidation with growth, as both Paul Martin and Ernesto Zedillo pointed out last night. And in that sense, what I think is a big issue right now is what is Europe going to do more for growth? And there are two aspects associated with it, which I think are difficult. One is, if you're going to get contraction in the periphery countries, what's the center going to do in terms of raising growth, particularly Germany? And second, as you said correctly, the financing is not an issue. But the financing will remain an issue unless you are prepared to put the European Central Bank at play. Okay. So those are two very difficult questions that have to be sorted out. On global imbalances, again, let me just be a little provocative and say there's been a huge shift in global imbalances. I mean, if you look at the numbers, you will see that emerging markets have shifted from surplus to large deficits, all with the exception of two parts, China, but where the surplus has gone down, and the Middle East, where the surplus has gone down even more. So actually, the emerging markets are pulling the world economy right now. Just to give you some very powerful numbers, not only now, but in the coming 5 years, China is going to contribute 3 times more to global growth than the United States, 6 times more than the euro area. India is going to contribute the same as the United States, twice that of the euro area. So in a way, the rebalancing of growth, which is the central part, has taken place. Indeed, I would say it's the limits, because the current account deficits of countries like India and Brazil and Turkey and South Africa are pretty much at the limit. They can't do more. So I do think there's a lot happening in terms of global rebalancing that is good. But we need to say, okay, what more is needed, and that's where the action plan comes in.
I'd like to go back to this issue of the crisis committee at the G20 and go back to how the G20 has handled the crisis. I think there are effectively two schools of thought here. There are people who are skeptical about what the G20 achieved and people who are more positive. I think there is, probably we have to look at where we were 3 years ago. The response that the G20 had in Washington, the first meeting, where just before Washington, Japan had put on the table, I think, $100 billion for help. This is a flexible credit line. China at that time said very clearly that we're not prepared to help because they were a poor country, therefore they couldn't help. Except then at the end of November, they implemented a very substantial fiscal stimulus pack. And then again, going towards London, there were a lot of differences. In particular, Germany were not prepared to take up more fiscal stimulus, and the whole issue got resolved. I think in the end, in London, we had probably some measures which were just a demonstration of being able to work together, which nevertheless gave a boost of confidence, because what we need, one of the ingredients we need right now is a boost of confidence and the ability to show that there is some, the leaders are able to work together and to overcome the differences. I was quite surprised by Changyong's comment on Asia crisis, and I know this is very much the feeling in Asia then why Asia was left to its own devices in 1997 and why now Europe should be helped. But there are lessons we learned from the Asian crisis, and in particular there are lessons we learned from the 2008 crisis, which to all accounts was a US crisis, financial crisis, which spilled over in the financial and banking system in Europe, but also in the real economy in Asia. So I think, again, to be practical and just even opportunistic here, I think it's much better to prevent disaster and crisis than just to mop up the mess afterwards. And I feel then this is the thing which a lot of people says in Asia, why should we put our money and resources in Europe. After all, we actually enhance and perpetuate a case of moral hazard, but because the risks are too high. And because of the messy decision-making process in Europe, we cannot come out with a neat solution on Greece. And that was very clear from the beginning. You know, Greece is not Argentina, sorry for reference to Argentina, and there are so many players involved in resolving the issue. Then obviously we have this absolutely dysfunctional decision-making process until we literally are 2 minutes to the disaster. So again, I think the G20 can provide the framework where actually European leaders can get their act together in a probably more effective way than just in Brussels. I'm not saying they don't do nothing, because I entirely agree with Jacques. There is actually some achievement there in a difficult situation. But I think the G20 is the sort of thing which provides some kind of focus for the European leaders. And that's why, again, I think it's a good crisis committee.
Okay, Changyong.
I think I spoke too much, but first I want to emphasize that when I hear that the European situation is not actually worse than US, by just focusing on the sovereign debt, it's a little bit misleading. Yes, in sovereign debt level is lower in average in Europe. On the other hand, if you look at the capital, the capital ratio and the leverage ratio of the European bank, in US after 2008, because of TARP, their capital is much improved. Now in Europe, actually, I think it's delayed response. So that's one of the reasons. And if you look at the banking situation at this moment, when the European sovereign debt, credit rating is decreased over the Greece debt problem really realized, and many European banks, they are not safe because of the, their leverage ratio is high. That's what exactly what financial markets are worrying about. So it's not just, even though it's called sovereign debt problem, now we are worrying about the spillover effect to the private sector. So private banks. So it's not that easy to say that this problem is just easy to, it's much easier than the American problem. I think it's as severe as, the American problem in 2008. That's why we are saying that some kind of program like TARP is needed to, to solve this, lower capital ratio in Europe. And as for the, Paolo, I was a little bit surprised, by listening to you, because you say that there is a process is inefficient and disorderly, but how come they got a better deal? I'm talking about the voluntary, so-called voluntary private sector involvement, haircut. In 1997, Korea really asked for some kind of voluntary, haircut. No response at all. And now you have a 50% voluntary haircut with this disorderly process. That is very hard to, shallow from us.
Can I say something? There is a big difference then, because South Korea is the example. South Korea had a currency, and you could depreciate your currency and boost your competitiveness, which is not something you can be done in Europe. And even the talks about getting Greece out of the euro zone, the monetary union, it's something which nobody knows how to manage. It's not something which was built in the system. It would create a lot of problems. The other thing is, South Korea had a growth rate and a growth path much better than Europe. So you could effectively, it was painful, I agree with you. And while here, if we take Greece as an example, Greece is not North Korea, sorry, it's not Korea, South Korea, and Greece is not Argentina. So, and it's a country which has huge problems well before getting into the monetary union, and it was a big mistake to get it in. That was a
I do not want to, this is not a good place to talk, but on the other hand, you can explain that way. On the other hand, another interpretation is that in our case, creditor was a foreigner, and we have debtor and creditors are different. This time, debtor and creditors are same in the group. And actually, I think the package is driven by to save the Eurozone problem, right? So the incentive structure is quite different. On the other hand, I think we are not complaining at ex post. What we are saying is that there is a lesson in 1997. So now the global governance mechanism in crisis management mechanism has to think about how to protect those kind of situations fairly. That's my point.
Okay, Oussama has been waiting patiently. I'm going to give the floor to him, and then I don't know, Jacques, whether you had a a brief comment. Then I'm going to open the floor to questions. There are already some in the queue, so if you have questions or comments, please push your button.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I'll make two very brief comments. First, I'd like to agree with Amar regarding what his last comments. With a slight nuance, I think I agree with you. I think other than the situation of Greece, where the debt service, debt to GDP ratio is clearly impossible, I wouldn't minimize the size, the scale of the problem in the other countries. And it really depends on, I completely agree with you, a lot of it in a way is self-inflicted, and in the sense it depends on how much policymakers instill in confidence in the markets. And Italy is a prime example. Italy's debt situation is very manageable at interest rates of 4. At current interest rates, it's not so clearly solvent, and it's a matter of how it's, what confidence that policymakers are able to instill. And picking up very briefly regarding Greece being different from Argentina and South Korea, it is, but I don't think the experience of places like South Korea and Argentina can be completely ignored in the context of the restructuring that is going on in Europe, which unfortunately I think it is. And I'll be just one specific issue that I find very, very alarming about what the EU summit is proposing is basically restructuring a voluntary debt exchange where bonds will be restructured with a 50% notional haircut on notional debt by the private sector bondholders only. However, we know that the public sector, including the ECB, is holding the very same bonds. When you introduce a debt restructuring, that you're already creating a problem in comparability of treatment of holders of the same debt instruments. You run into legal issues, so I'm not sure this is fully legal, but it's certainly not particularly moral. And that is the problem that I find in what is being presented. I'm not sure it'll succeed. I actually feel it will fail, in which case we have an even bigger problem.
Okay, let's, Jacques, did you? Okay, if not, we'll go to the floor. We're going to run, for the people sending me notes saying wrap it up, we're going to run on a few extra minutes, so which means we'll truncate the coffee break. So those who want coffee, just feel free to get up and wander in and grab a cup. First is table 11.
Yeah, thanks for a very good discussion, Simon Maxwell. We come to these meetings for two kinds of takeaways. The first is to learn something about the topics, whether it's oceans or nuclear, or in this session, global financial crises. But the actual exam question is really, what do we learn about the G20? And one of the observations I make listening to yesterday and today is that there is a kind of deification of the London summit as this is the success story we need to emulate, and it's been downhill ever since. And I would just like to hear a little bit more about really whether the London summit was such a success. And I remember, Tom, at the meeting that Brookings and KDI and you organized in Seoul last year, Larry Elliott gave a passionate and entertaining and well-founded critique of why the G20 summit in London was essentially a public affairs masterstroke with very little substance. And I've tried to find it on Google while you were talking, and he's been written out of history. I can't find it anywhere on the web. So, of course, there is something to be said for public relations masterstrokes because they build confidence, as Paoloa said. But I'd just like to hear the panel and anybody else really tell me, was London the success that people said it was, or was it not?
Who on the panel wants to...
To me, the success was confidence. That's it. I agree. It was a master example of ability to create this. It was a public affairs thing. I entirely agree, but it worked, and it worked at the moment where lots of people were thinking then there was no solution out of the crisis. So it worked because it shows then countries can get together and can provide a solution. Even if the solution was then when we start to look behind the agreements in London, we started to see, who put the money down and how well funded was this flexible credit line, and which country used this flexible credit line, which I believe was only 3 of them, because again, but that was a good show. And then I don't think then it was downhill since. It was actually the G20 became more like what we call a steering committee, doing the hard work. And I'm aware that there are people behind the scenes, so before the big event in Cannes or in London or in Seoul, which actually work hard to make sure that some of the steps that they end up in the communiqué are achieved. And any communicate, in my view, becomes a bit more specific on commitments, so less fluffy and vague and more specific on things. And again, if I look at the work done this year, there are some in my field, which is, again, finance and macro, the fact that we could agree on these guidelines for, imbalances, although we call them in a different way, it's a good step forward. MAP is a very good step forward. The fact that the IMF undertook this review of the spillovers, the review of the systemically important countries, it's a very good step forward. It's something we knew intuitively, then obviously the UK has a large financial sector, therefore has an impact on the Eurozone. But the fact that it was done in a sort of analytical way provides a lot of, support what we knew but we couldn't really prove. And now we have to move forward and show them the dynamics of this bill. So all this stuff is good stuff. Then there is still, as Amar said, a huge agenda, and each of these issues, even in the financial and economic agenda, typical of the G20, each of them need to be drilled down, and again, there is quite a lot of work.
Okay, Paolo says it was both PR and substance, but Mark has comments.
One big part of the problem that world economy had in 2008 was a confidence crisis, right? The risk premium had gone up, people were deeply uncertain. And in that sense, what we needed was a hugely successful PR exercise to restore confidence. And that's what we got, and it was hugely successful, and it worked. And we should, I think, so obviously there's always the afterglow of history about these things, but actually I think the success is well merited. I think it deserved it. I mean, it's interesting if you then look forward to discussions since then, basically, realistically, what countries are going to agree to at these things are things that they were going to do anyway, pretty much. But it's the way they agree to them. If they agree to them with a sort of the nice positive spin around them, that gets people confident. If, on the other hand, you have the sort of discussions that we've had in subsequent meetings, where at least on a couple of occasions, it's kind of got poisonous over things like exchange rate regimes, over sizes of current account deficits and stuff. Countries still go on and pretty much do the same thing anyway, but the aura around them is much more negative, and it's a blow to confidence. And again, one of the neat lessons that's come out of the last few years is that hard to pin down but nebulous factor of confidence is hugely important for the way the world economy works.
Thank you. Table 8.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. I have a slightly provocative, maybe even exaggerated comment just for discussion, if nothing else. Here's this discussion. It's more about the nature of G20 than about the European crisis. But one hears this discussion, and if you are not in the G20 and if you are not in Europe, you kind of sit and think, is the purpose of G20 to constantly put safety nets under the transatlantic economic order? Is the idea really that because now the world economy is larger, the transatlantic economic powers cannot themselves constantly do that, therefore you need other players to constantly put that in? And I wonder, if there was a financial crisis tomorrow in China, which would also have spillover effects, whether we would see it as just a financial crisis or a political opportunity of some sort. And I know I'm being provocative here, but I do wonder whether, and I realize we will be focusing on Europe in the next many months, and maybe we should, but one wonders whether the purpose of G20 is really to try to prolong the, again, what I'm calling the transatlantic economic order as long as possible. Or is it to make way maybe for a different move, which is happening naturally, and maybe that will mean spillovers, and maybe that will mean some blow-ups and some blood spilling, and that will be painful, but maybe that is the writing on the wall of economic history. Now, if you were not talking about Europe constantly at this point, what else could the G20 talk about that will have major impact on the global economy? One candidate I would suggest is demography. At some point this week, the 7 billionth baby was born somewhere in the world. When you hold CIGI'11, it would be 8 billion. And I'm not talking about population control here, I'm just talking about the economic angle of demography. I'm talking about WTO and Mode 4 and labor movements and consumer shifts. That's where, if you were taking a long view of the global economy, the discussion would be, and where the G20 would be a forum that would be unlike every other to think about the global economy in a different way. So I don't know what the question there is, except what is the purpose of the G20, and is it anything more than simply putting a safety net under the current economic order?
Maybe Judd Davis in the next session will tell us about scenario building and how to get leaders looking ahead to the future problems. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to take a question from table 3 now, and then I'm going to go quickly around the table, so if panelists want to address Adil's question or the ones to come, or anything else they haven't got out yet that they wanted to. Table 3.
Thank you. My question actually builds on the last question, because it's entirely appropriate that the most dominant and urgent crisis in Europe should consume most of the time at the G20. But it's not the only economic crisis in the world. I mean, there are other crises in other parts of the world which are equally urgent and which equally need attention. The problem of inequality within countries and between countries is causing all sorts of problems of unemployment, hunger and food security. There's housing and informal settlements are issues which need to be addressed and which are not being addressed on the table, all of which really points to the fact that, in a sense, the thing with the G20 is the G7 agenda is still dominating that, and the ease of getting anything else into that agenda in a useful way is extremely difficult. And so I would like to hear the panel's comments on that, and to suggest also as an additional challenge to that is when you look at financial regulation, I would suggest it's not as happy a story as is being suggested, because all the issues that are being addressed on the financial agenda are issues of interest to the G7 countries and to the biggest banks in the world. If you look at what's happening in most countries in the world, questions of capital adequacy and derivatives are not the most important issues. Questions of financial inclusion and how you include people in financial services altogether, how small and medium-sized businesses should get access to credit, are equally important and much more important in terms of dealing with the inequality that's such an important security issue. And I would put to you, just as a tell to that, to think about the Arab Spring, because without the focus on inequality and unemployment, that would not have become the security issue that it has become now as well.
Okay, Amar, you want to just start, and we'll go around the table quickly.
Let me start with Daniel's last point. I mean, in substance, I entirely agree, but I would say that, the reality is that the short term dominates, and leaders have to always struggle to keep an eye on the long term, and that's true at the national level as it is at the global level. And I think the issues of unemployment and inequality actually figure very much in the political space of the discussions right now, which is good, but the question is, what do you translate it into? In the specific case of finance, actually the G20 has been very, very active in the area of financial inclusion, but it's not only the G20, it's also the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, and it's one area where, in some sense, the pace of experimentation and the pace of change is great, and it is coming from the South. And the South-South learning on that has been very important. We had a very big meeting in Mexico. The president of Mexico participated in that meeting. And it will be a very big issue, I hope, and I know that it will be for the Mexican summit. So we certainly, as developing countries, want to push very hard on that agenda. Coming to Adil's point, which on the issue of is the G20 just a safety net for the transatlantic economic order? I would argue that the whole increase in IMF resources that happened in 2008, and it wasn't just for the PCL and the FCL. Those were the instruments, but the whole NAB and the quota increase and the SDR allocations, which I think happened very much because of UK leadership, by the way, at that time, has helped position the IMF, perhaps not adequately so, but it has helped position the IMF so that it can provide resources of the scale that it was not able to provide during the Asian crisis. And as far as we are concerned, it's very much focused on the innocent bystanders. One of the areas where I think more needs to be done is in the area of concessional resources, especially for poor and vulnerable countries. But that's a remaining issue. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Yes, I am, again, sorry to go back to the crisis, and I don't want to sound that because I'm European, we need to use that to help Europe. But the point is, the crisis, a major European crisis will spill over on other countries. And again, if you look at the contribution to growth in 2010, the only country we actually contributed more than anybody else to the world's GDP growth is China with 1.5. Then the US and Europe has a contribution which was slightly more than each big emerging market economy on its own. But on the other hand, the distribution, if you look at the distribution of the world output, we still have the US and the Eurozone standing out. So they still have they're still the countries with the largest share, and followed by China at 16.2%. These are 2010 data. So again, what I want to say is, it's better not to risk, and an impact of a crisis in Europe, a big spillover in Europe, will be really global. So there is an argument here. I really would like to see a stop to this Euro crisis discussion, not least because I agree is using a lot of resources. My best case scenario is then the G20 will really help to put together this plan, which includes also a financial safety net for the innocent bystanders. The flexible credit line in London, 2009, was actually to help the innocent bystanders rather than the culprits. And I still believe that countries like Greece and Italy need the classic IMF program because they have to go through their own structural problems. Maybe we can discuss conditionality, and I think the IMF, and I believe that the IMF is now looking into the issue of conditionality and in a different way, rethinking conditionality. But they're not let off the hook with a free lunch. They will have to do something. But it has to be a sort of holistic plan which takes into account all different aspects. And then after we have a financial safety net which can prevent any banking and financial crisis, then we can let Greece to default and we can discuss how much is the haircut and how it can be done. But at least we know that it's not going to spill over the rest of the world, and we have a good firewall. So what is the purpose of the G20? A minimum, at the minimum level, I think, just, give confidence and say we are in charge and we have some ideas, and try to get all these other, especially the Europeans, to get together and try a way to crystallize decision and come up with a plan. That would be, I think, a minimum achievement, but I think that the G20 can do more than that.
Thanks. Mark?
To echo that a little bit, I mean, sure, you might be skeptical about the G20's role as propping up a faltering Eurozone, but again, the lessons are when the big countries fall over, it's not just them that suffer. I mean, if you think about 2008, when things went badly wrong in the United States, that ricocheted around the world, and it took a pretty heavy toll on Asian growth. I mean, there was a big and effective policy response, but for a couple of quarters, growth stalled. There was huge increases in joblessness, big increases in uncertainty, nasty implications for poverty, both in the region and globally. So it's not a parochial concern to try and stop things going badly wrong in Europe. It matters to everybody else, including not a large chunk of people who are kind of on the margins. I mean, if their factory goes under, they're going to be in serious trouble. And an awful lot of Asian policy debate at the moment is all about, what do we do if and when the Eurozone crisis goes critical? How much policy space have we got left? How big are the spillovers going to be? What can we do to keep jobs going? So I don't think it is just a case of keeping the old order afloat and that there's no benefit in it from the rest of us. I think there is. And you mentioned what would the reaction be if China went under. Well, in Australia it would be wholesale panic, I have to say. So we would certainly be shouting and crying that we would need an awful lot of support to go to the Chinese economy. Luckily, I don't think that's is going to be the case going forward right now. But I think there'd be. That said, though, I think, and again, it's one point, there is an element of double standards in terms of the response to the way the crises have responded to. Some of that, I think you can legitimately say, well, we've learned from our mistakes. Some of it is just double standards, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do the right thing this time just because you did the wrong thing last time.
I will focus my comment on global growth. Ambassador Aranda remembered that at the beginning of the year, everyone was in a mood where the global recovery was underway. The first and biggest bad news of 2011 is not the euro, is not the debt ceiling, is not finance, it's the reconsideration everywhere after the second quarter that the recovery was definitely not as solid than expected. And this is what everyone has today at the back of the head, that we do not see where are the next engines of growth. We know that they are weak in the US, they are weak in Greece. Thank you for paying so much attention to Greece, but they are weak more generally in the Eurozone. They are not so strong as was mentioned for the global economy as they appear in China, because the reorientation of Chinese economic growth based on domestic momentum is something which is happening, but which is happening slowly. So the major difference with London is that in London we were in the deepest of the Great Recession, and the stimulus was the answer. This is the stimulus which built confidence. So now everyone knows that we are not in a deep recession, but we know that growth is weakening and that governments are no more in the situation they had in 2008 and in 2009 to stimulate the global growth. This is the biggest thing today.
I would just pick up on the idea of what's the role of the G20 and maybe that it's focusing too much on not so much on the non-G20 countries. But I would say I think I completely agree with Paola and the figures that she mentioned on Europe's significance for the global economy. But I would actually go a step further. I think if you look over the last 10 years, and you take the direction of trade statistics from the IMF and plot some charts to see where the growth in exports of emerging markets, where it's been going to. You will find that intra-emerging market exports, we know that story because of commodities, of course, has been the largest one. But the most significant stable source of growth for emerging market exports has been Europe. It's not the United States. And I would submit that a more serious crisis in Europe is actually going to have a bigger downside on a lot of developing countries than the US did in 2008 during the crisis.
I'll be quick, I think. I mean, as for the short-term versus long-term issues, I think that's exactly why when we host the G20, we propose development as an important agenda. And I really hope that Mexico can continue to take development as important as other financial and economic issues, because as the question raises, I think this is for the legitimacy of the G20. But having said that, but on the other hand, I think classification of financial issues for G7 and the other issues for the developing countries, I think it's a little bit misleading. And what they are, for example, you mentioned the financial inclusion as an example. Financial inclusion is very important for low-income countries. But on the other hand, financial regulation that the G7 countries mostly are talking these days will definitely impact the financial market development in Asia and the other developing countries soon. So because we are developing. So I think in the financial issue and economic issue, not only because of the spillover effect, but because of the multipolar world, is no longer just a G7 issue. And we have to, we have to have more active participation from the emerging economies and low-income countries for these issues too.
Thank you. Let me thank our panelists for, I think, a very good opening session. Please join me. I know there were some more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. The short-term edges out the long-term. One of the things we didn't get to talk about was green growth, which Lourdes mentioned is a topic of interest to Mexico. Perhaps our next panel under Barry will talk about green growth and the answer to all of these problems. Thank you very much.